Hey guys, I'm John. I've personally scored a 760 on the SAT reading section. I also currently own the biggest online SAT school community in the world. In this video, I'm going to show you how to do punctuation questions in the grammar section of the SAT. Let me start by telling you a quick story. So I had a student back before the December SAT, and he came to me back in like November, pretty soon before the test. So not as much time as I wish I would have had with him, but basically what he told me is that he was getting above 700 scores in the reading section. And so I was like, okay, wow, amazing. So you already are scoring very, very high in the SAT reading section. And so I asked him, which questions are you still struggling with though? Because I was expecting him to say something like passage questions, maybe student notes questions if he's really unlucky, vocab questions. But no, he said grammar questions was his biggest weakness in the entire reading and writing section. And I was like, what? Like, how is that your biggest weakness? How is that the thing holding you back from a higher score? And so I remember I literally had a session with him, a 1-hour tutoring call, where I just went through basically every single thing in SAT grammar. And we had a few more calls as well, but it was the kind of thing where I was just showing him things and just immediately, as soon as he was seeing them, or pretty much immediately, he was changing how he was approaching these problems. And he went from having no idea how to do them to basically being perfect in SAT grammar. And then by the time he took the test, he actually got a 780 in the reading section. So really good job for him. He did amazing on the test in the end. He was definitely able to get past the grammar stuff. But what I'm trying to say with this is grammar is genuinely the thing where you can go from absolutely knowing nothing to being really, really good at it practically overnight. So pay attention as close as you can to this video because it genuinely may change everything for you. And I know this stuff works because it works for everybody who actually uses it and applies it. Now, the first thing you really have to know is that grammar on the SAT, a lot of people think it's kind of like this vague, confusing mess of stuff. They think they just look at grammar questions and they just have to choose whatever answer feels the best, whatever answer sounds the best in their mind. And the issue with this is, for students who are really, really good at grammar naturally, this will work. But if you aren't at that level, if you aren't like getting every single grammar question right, you're probably one of the people for whom this strategy does not work. And instead, you have to approach grammar a bit more like you approach, may sound a little bit weird, but math. Because when you do a math question on the SAT, you can't just rely on vibes. You can't just rely on what sounds right or what feels right. You have to actually approach it systematically. 1 + 1 must equal 2. It doesn't just equal whatever sounds the best. There's clear formulas, there's clear strategies, there's clear concepts, and that's how you do a math question. And in grammar, even though it may not seem like it, that's the same thing. There are logical, reasonable ways why grammar in the English language works the way it does. And if you learn these things, these questions can actually be extremely easy because you can just look at the sentence, think, does it have these certain things? And then if it does, answer must be this. If it doesn't, the answer must be this. So the first thing with that, the first systematic way you should look at these is with independent clauses. Independent clauses is, put simply, a clause, meaning a group of words in a sentence that can exist entirely on its own. You can just have it and then have a period right after it because you don't need anything else for it to fully be fine. But what does that really mean? Because I can say that forever, but many people don't get what that actually means when you look at a sentence. What does a sentence have to actually include to be a full thought? Well, first it has to have a subject. A subject is the thing doing the action. If I write a sentence like, let's say, John goes to the store, John would, of course, just be the subject for that. Pretty simple. It's just the thing doing the action. If it has no subject, you just know automatically not an independent clause. Then it has to have a main verb. In a general sense, a main verb is the main action of the sentence. So in this sentence, of course, John goes to the store, the main action is just goes. That's what is happening. That's the verb, etc. But if we want to be a bit more specific, it also is a verb that does not begin with to, it does not begin with that, and it does not end in ing. If it has any of those, then it automatically is not a main verb. So if I was to write a word like running, that would not be a main verb. If I was to write a verb like to run, also not a main verb. That runs, not a main verb. But if I just put runs, yes, that would be a main verb. So those two main things. First, it has to be the main action, and second, it can't fall into any of those categories. So in a sentence like this, the student who didn't study failed the SAT. What would be the main verb here? Well, the main action of the sentence is failed. That's what happened to the student. The student failed, that was really bad, etc. But we also have another verb here, which is study. But that's not the main verb of the sentence because that's just an extra piece of information you're adding. It's not the main action of the sentence. But the thing with independent clauses is it just has to contain a main verb. As long as there's just one main verb, then you're fine. It counts for the second rule. Third, the sentence cannot begin with a wasabi word. Wasabi words are words like while, when, since, after, all this stuff here. You'll get more used to what counts as a wasabi word as you do more of these sentences, so you don't need to memorize these immediately. You should just know that if it starts with one of these, immediately not an independent clause, dependent automatically. Nothing else really matters. Quick challenge for you, is this an independent clause? He runs. Now, a student who's going just off of vibes would probably be like, no, there's no way that could be an independent clause. But since you know this now, you would realize this actually is an independent clause because it has a subject, he, and it has a main verb, runs. It also does not begin with any wasabi word. So that's literally how systematic this stuff is. It can be something that would never in a million years look like it would be the case, but if it just adheres to the rules, then it must be the case, just automatically. But here's why you actually need to know this stuff, because there are different ways to separate stuff based off of whether it's an independent or dependent clause. If you have two independent clauses right back to each other, you can either separate them with a period, just like end of the sentence, semicolon, or a comma followed by fanboys. Fanboys are the words for, and, nor, but, or, yet, or so. But really for the SAT, what you really need to know is the ones and but. Those are the ones going to be coming up the majority of the times. So these are really the only three ways, and it's really not much more complicated than that. Like, if you see any of the three things, you know it must be separating an independent clause and another independent clause. There's not really any exception to that. Except, I guess, complex lists, which I'll get to in a second, but that's really like a very uncommon thing. So not really many besides that. Then if you have an independent clause and dependent clause, it can be separated either with a comma. This is like 95% of the time, just a comma, or nothing at all. So it could just be like, independent clause and then dependent clause right after that. Other things you should know are colons, dashes, and parentheses. These can be used to separate either of the two. So it can be independent, or independent and dependent. So don't need to really memorize these. I'm going to go over these a bit more in a second, but these are just some other good things to know. So look at this. The student who didn't study failed the SAT. That would be an independent clause because we have student, which is the subject, failed, the main verb, and no wasabi word. Then we have here, he didn't join mission 1400 plus. He is the subject, join is the main verb, no wasabi word. So we can separate this just with a period. We could also use a semicolon, or we could say so, because that would be comma plus a fanboy's word. You could also have something like this. Since the student didn't study, you notice since that is one of the wasabi words. So that's a dependent clause. And we have he failed the SAT. This would be an independent clause because we have he, then failed, and then no wasabi word in that one. So we can just use a comma there to separate those two. If this doesn't fully make sense to you right now, no worries. You can definitely reference this as you do more questions, and naturally it'll start making more and more sense. Actually, probably by the time you finish watching this video, you'll will have this thing fully internalized in your mind because you're going to be seeing so many more examples with this as I go through the rest of this stuff. So it's just going to kind of start coming together. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to talk about all the different situations in which you can use each individual punctuation on the SAT. So periods, commas, semicolons, all that. Because this is the basics that I've already covered, but now you need to know actually the use cases of them so you know whether what you're doing is a thing that you can do. First kind of punctuation we have is a period. As I've already said, literally the only time you can use this is to separate an independent clause and then another independent clause. Literally no other situation. So if we look at here, in 1969, computer scientist, actually, I'll skip the first sentence. Her code famously prevented a system overload during the Apollo 11 lunar descent. This was a moment that highlighted the value of error detection routines in early computing. Before the blank, we have her code, that would be the subject. Prevented is the main verb and no wasabi word, so independent there. Then after we have this, which would be the subject, was, which would be the main verb, and no wasabi word either there. So since there's two independent clauses, we know it has to be one of those three separations that we specifically noted over here. And so therefore, the only one that matches that out of these choices would be B. That was easy, but now let's go over one that has a few more cases, the comma. This has 5 different situations in which you can use it. Thankfully, most of them are pretty easy to remember though. First thing you can use it for is a list. Lists are things where you essentially just have a group of different terms and you're just putting them all together. So I can say something here like John went to the store, the gas station, and his home. The 3 things here are the store, the gas station, and then his home, so we have to separate them with commas after each individual item. So in this sentence, the chef's signature tasting menu featured blank, pickled rhubarb, and a saffron-infused consommé that took 12 hours to prepare. Looks like we have 4 different items in this list because it can be more than 3, so therefore the answer must be B. We're just using commas to separate it, nothing else. It can't be the other ones because this one doesn't have a comma after this one, which you need to have if you're separating a thing in a list. This one doesn't have a comma after the first one, and this one uses semicolons, which just is not how you use stuff in a list. Second thing you can use a comma for, as I said before, is comma plus fanboys. And keep in mind, this is only to separate two independent clauses again. That's literally the only case of to use comma in a fanboy after that. So if we look at here, the Voyager 1 spacecraft launched in 1977 and has now traveled beyond the heliopause. It continues to transmit data back to Earth more than 4 decades after its mission began. So the Voyager 1 spacecraft, that's the subject. This is one of the rare situations in which you would have two main verbs in here, both launched and traveled. The reason why is because you have and here. When you have and, you can use more than one main verb in a sentence. Beyond the heliopause, and it continues to transmit data back. In this second one here, we have here it, and then continues, and then no wasabi word again. So we have to use comma and fanboys, and we already have a comma here, so we can just use a fanboys word, which would just be and. We don't need another comma because you just don't need to use one after you have the fanboys word. Third thing is non-essential information. What non-essential information is information that, well, quite literally is not essential for the sentence. You can eliminate it from the sentence and it will still make grammatical and logical sense. Both of those are important, like not just sounds good, but also makes sense in your mind. So if we look at here, the novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, whose 2013 novel Americana won the National Book Critics Circle Award, has become one of the most influential voices. So whose 2013 novel, this thing is actually not important for the sentence to make sense. If I literally just eliminate that from the sentence, we can just say the novelist Chimamanda Ngozi has become one of the most influential voices. That makes sense, like it's logical, I still get what's being said there. So therefore, we can put a comma both before and after it to make it non-essential information. So the answer here can just be B. But let's look at this one here. In her latest study, evolutionary biologist Hoppy Hoekstra examines how deer, mice in the sandhills, etc. Shout out to my computer for literally deleting the second half of the video the first time I recorded it. It's fine. I'll just re-record it again. Totally didn't ruin my entire day or anything. But anyways, back to this problem. So if we think about it for a second, if we get rid of Hoppy Hoekstra from the text, it just says, in her latest study, evolutionary biologist examines how deer, mice in the sandhills developed whatever. It's just saying evolutionary biologist. We have no idea which evolutionary biologist we're talking about here. It could be me, it could be, I don't know, Steve Jobs, it could be Bill Gates, it could just be some random person off the street. We have no idea. So the sentence doesn't logically make sense anymore now that we deleted those words. So therefore, this actually would not be non-essential information. It would actually be essential information because we need the name to understand what's being said here. So we're going to have to actually go for D for the right answer. We also do not have another comma after Hoppy Hoekstra, so it also just can't be non-essential information regardless because you need a comma both before and after. A good rule of thumb is whenever you know the person they're referring to, it typically is non-essential information because you don't need that information to understand who we're talking about. But if you don't know who the person is, then it's probably not non-essential information because that information probably is really important to understand the person. For example, this one over here, it says here Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. We already know the exact person who is writing this book. So therefore, we can eliminate this second part and we still know who we're talking about because we know this person's exact name. Therefore, that can be non-essential information because you don't need that extra information to identify the person. Now let's look at this one. The painting blank, Frida Kahlo, completed in 1939, has been the subject of this debate. So first of all, if we use the rule from before, if we get rid of everything after the blank because there's no other comma in the sentence, yeah, that doesn't really make much sense. The painting, that's not a complete sentence. That's just a subject, no verbs there. But also you can just kind of know that whenever you have that being used, typically it is not non-essential information. When you see the word that, typically it actually is essential information for the text. That's just kind of something that typically happens in English. So therefore A is going to be the right answer here. All right, just two more left for commas. The first one of the two is introductory information. This is basically just a repeat of what I said over here about independent clauses and dependent clauses. Essentially, you might see a sentence where it starts with a dependent clause, or if it ends with a dependent clause, you have to use a comma to separate both the independent and dependent. In this one here, after analyzing soil samples collected from 3 continents over a decade, it begins with the word after, and that is a wasabi word, so therefore this first part would be a dependent clause. But then you can see here, the team of geochemists concluded. So we have a subject, the team of geochemists, and then also a main verb, which is concluded. So this part here would be an independent clause. So we have to use a comma to separate them, which would be B. Now, technically, according to my rules here, you could also sometimes use just a straight up Continuation, you can just use no punctuation to separate them, but 95% of the time it's going to be a comma to separate independent and dependent. It's really only rare cases, like if you have the word that, like I was saying before, that you would use no punctuation. So err on the side of commas versus no commas. Then the last thing here, which is pretty uncommon, but I decided to include it, is adjectives. Let's say if we have the sentence here, Mission 1400 Plus is an effective, fun way to study for the SAT. We have effective, comma, fun. We can do that because you could also theoretically write the sentence as effective and fun. Whenever that's the case, whenever you theoretically could use an and instead, you can replace that and with a comma. And speaking of which, if you do want to use Mission 1400 Plus to improve your score, check out the link in the description. It's one of the most fun ways to study for the SAT, plus you get my full math and reading courses. Now on to semicolons. There are really only two uses of this, so a lot simpler than commas. The first, as I've already said, is to separate an independent clause and another independent clause. I'm not going to give you another example because I've kind of talked about this already a bunch in this video, but yeah, two independent clauses you can use a semicolon separated. But then the second thing is a little bit weirder, I'll be honest, which is complex lists. So I told you over here this idea of a regular list where you have multiple different items and you have to use commas to separate them. But what if in one of the items you have a comma already? So what if there's like a comma in this first item, a comma in the second one, and a comma in the third? You can't still use commas to separate them because then it's just going to get confusing. Like, is this an item? Is that an item? Like, which is the full item here? So instead you have to upgrade the outside commas to semicolons in this case. So just kind of a simple upgrade. So now you have a clear differentiation between what is part of the item and what is actually a separator. So for this here, we can see the exhibition featured works from 3 distinct cities: Lagos, Nigeria, Nairobi, Kenya, and Accra, Ghana. These are 3 different items because they're each city followed by the country that they're in, but we of course have to use a comma to separate the city and the country. So therefore, B is going to be the right answer here because it has a semicolon on the outside to be the bigger separator, but also Lagos, Nigeria for the smaller separator on the inside. It can't be these other ones because none of them have a semicolon. And also a really good way to know if it's complex list is if you see a semicolon followed by the word and in the passage. If you see that, it's definitely 100% going to be a complex list because there's nothing else in the English language, at least to my knowledge, that involves a semicolon followed by the word and. Onto colons. The thing you should know about colons on the SAT is they're not too complicated, but if you see one as an answer choice, there's a very high likelihood it's actually going to be right. I'm not saying 100% of the time, probably not even like 90% of the time, but like a majority of the time it's going to end up being right. Just because the SAT writers like to use this kind of weird, lesser known punctuations as correct answers. So if you're down between like a colon and a comma and you have no other way to determine between them, honestly choose colon over comma, which might not be what you expect. You might expect me to say comma because they're so common, but it's the exact opposite. The only time you use a colon is for what I call an extension. Basically, this is when you have a sentence and then the part after the colon is like a elaboration or a essentially continuation of what was said before. Here's an example of that. Marine biologist Edith Witter has dedicated her career to studying one of the ocean's most elusive phenomena, bioluminescence. So the phenomena that she's talking about is the bioluminescence. It's basically, that's what we're referring to here. And then it says what that actually would be. Therefore, A is going to be the right answer. We have phenomena and then an extension of what that phenomena actually is. It would not be the comma in this case because if there is any kind of extension, you just automatically go for colon over comma, kind of like I was saying before. It's not really a complex thing. We have to decide, okay, is this enough of an extension to make it a colon? No, the SAT is not really trying to trick you here. If there is some kind of extension, just go for the colon as the choice. The microbiologist's findings challenge a decades-old assumption. Certain extremophiles can in fact survive in certain environments. Okay, so same thing here. We have assumption and then they explain what that assumption is. So we're going to have to go for D for the answer. Real quick, I just want to talk about question marks. I could skip this, but honestly, there's a maybe 2% chance you see this on the next SAT, and then somebody's going to leave a comment and be mad at me and everything. So I just want to really quickly talk about it. A question mark is only used if you are, you guessed it, asking a question. I know it's kind of simple, but the way you know if it is a question is if it begins with one of these unique question words like which, why, how, do, any of that stuff. It has to begin with it as the first word in the sentence for it to be asking a question. If it doesn't, they're not trying to trick you. It's just not a question, bro. So we have this one here. The team's central research question was straightforward. Which behavioral patterns help predict which species are most vulnerable to habitat loss? Which would be one of these words. The only time the question word doesn't literally have to be the first word is if you have a situation like this with a colon, where that basically splits off the sentence so you can start from scratch. If I rewrote the sentence like this, we would not use a question mark because which is just the random word in the middle of the sentence and there's no colon before it. So therefore, if it doesn't start with a question word, we just have to go for a period like usual. So onto dashes now. This may look kind of hard, but it's actually just a continuation of stuff I've already said in this video. It's just another punctuation mark you can use for the same things. First is non-essential information. So just the same thing I said before, if you can get rid of the information and have it still make full grammatical and logical sense, you can use a dash. You just have to make sure to have a dash both before and after the non-essential information. So in this one here, the man says shrimp's eyes contain 16 types of photoreceptors, 4 times as many as the human eye. We can get rid of 4 times as many as the human eye, so therefore it's non-essential information. B would be the right answer. The second thing you can use a dash for is the exact same thing as a colon, which is an extension. So in a sentence like this one here, astronomers studying the early universe have identified one consistent pattern, galaxies in the first billion years. So the pattern they're talking about is the galaxies. Therefore, we could use a colon or a dash like this. And we don't have a colon as a choice, so we have to choose a dash. I don't think there's really ever going to be a situation where we have both a colon and a dash as the choice, so just rely on this. But I guess if you did have one, you would probably want to choose a colon because it's a little bit of a cleaner choice, but dashes work the exact same way. Now, real quick, before I end this video, I just want to talk about a few other random punctuation examples that sometimes do confuse students that I should mention real quick. This first thing here is whenever you have a transition word in the choice. So this word, however, that is typically what you see in the transition section of the SAT, but it can appear here as well. When you see something like this, you have to just follow this exact format. Essentially, what's going to be the case is you're going to have this sentence at the beginning. You're going to have one full sentence with a period at the end. Then you're going to have 2 parts of the following sentence. The first part is before the semicolon. The second part is after the semicolon. Now, what you have to think to yourself, if the first sentence contradicts with the first half of the second sentence, then you put the however before the semicolon. But if the first part of the second sentence contradicts with the second part of the second sentence, then you put the however after the semicolon. Now, this probably makes no sense seeing this. Let me give you an actual example. Quantum computing is an interesting new technology. Quantum computers can theoretically solve certain problems exponentially faster than classical computers. However, they remain extraordinarily difficult to build. So thinking about it here, the part that's contradicting is this part here, which is that they can solve certain problems faster, and then the part that they say they're still difficult to build. Because we're basically saying here, quantum computers are really good, they can do stuff really, really well, but there's still some really big problems with them, like they're really hard, really expensive to build. So therefore it's B contradicting with C, so we have to put however after the semicolon, like for choice A. But if we have one here, internet culture has been around for decades. Skibidi Riz is different, however. The world in the 1990s never could expect the destruction that Skibidi Riz and its followers have caused. The contradiction here is between this idea that it's been around for decades and then this idea here that's now different. They literally say the word different, so it's a contradiction. It's something contrary to what you would expect. So in this situation, A would be contradicting with B instead. And so in that case, you have to put the however before the semicolon, just like I do in this one here, however, then semicolon. But you have to make sure that you understand this still follows the typical SAT independent dependent clause rules that I've already gone over. So if we have something like this channel, however, will make it very simple. You have to think to yourself, is there an independent clause both before and after the however? And there would not be. This channel, that is not an independent clause. There's no verb there. And we'll make it very simple. That's also not an independent clause because it's only a verb. It has no subject. So therefore, we cannot use a semicolon at all to separate these two. It just would not work. Instead, we just have to use regular commas, and we have this just be non-essential information like we've talked about before. The only reason these work the way they do is because they have an independent clause both before and also after the semicolon. So therefore, we can use a semicolon as the punctuation. Whenever you see an SAT punctuation question, you should solve it like this. First, just take a quick glance at the choices they give you to determine what you're really working with. Are they mainly semicolons, periods, colons, whatever? Then go back to the passage and figure out which is an independent clause and which is a dependent clause. With that alone, you probably will be able to eliminate maybe 1 or 2 or maybe even all 3 of the choices immediately. If you cannot eliminate 3 wrong answers, then go and use the rest of the stuff that is discussed about the different punctuations to figure out what the answer must be. So for example, in this one that I showed before, I would look at this here. I see we have periods and commas and that kind of stuff. I look at this, we see we have an independent clause both before and after. Therefore, I know it can't be A, it can't be C, and it can't be D, so B must be the right answer. But then for this one here, I would see, okay, we have a colon as one of the choices. I go back to the passage and I see, so studying was elusive phenomena, bioluminescence. So we have independent clauses before and then a dependent clause after. So we know it can't be D, so it could be A, B, or C. So now I have to go to the other rules. And I know that colons are always used for extensions, so therefore we should go for A for the answer. It's even better than a comma. If you want some more help on implementing the stuff from this video, make sure to join Mission 1400 Plus with the link in the description below. I will actually help you one-on-one to help you better understand this stuff, and I will answer any of the questions that you bring to me in the community. It's really one of the most fun and effective ways to study for the SAT, so definitely join it if you have the chance before your next test. Anyways, that's all for me. Hope you do well on the SAT, and stay Gucci.